Now, it's a very cold Monday morning. Time to say a very good morning to Mr. Peter Hitchens. Peter, how are you?
Well, okay, my brakes froze on my bicycle this morning, but
Oh,
I
God.
managed to frozen, so here I am.
What happens when that
Brief.
when that happens? I didn't see many cyclists out this morning.
You become totally immobile. That's what happens, and then you turn the bicycle upside down and fiddle with it, and then you release it. But it's quite alarming.
Well, I must admit, I'd be a bit wary of black ice and that kind of thing, wouldn't you?
Yes. Well, you can't use cycle paths and things like that. You have to stick to the main roads because they've been gritted.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I did wonder about that, actually, because the one cyclist I did see on the way in was on the road, and I was about to suggest to him that he moved to the cycleway, but maybe that was the reason.
Well, that is the reason, and a lot of cyclists are either not going out, or if they are out, then they have to use the main roads because very few authorities actually bother to grit or clear cycle tracks. They just don't seem to think it matters, although they all pose as being cycle-friendly, they aren't really.
Right, yeah. Well, I seem to remember as well, they built one of the cycle superhighways, as they call it, rather laughably in London, and it was made with such a slippery material that they had to rip it all up again because cyclists were coming around, I think it was Vauxhall Bridge or somewhere, and just sliding off the cycle path because it was so slippery.
That's completely credible. And what local authorities do tend to do is they design these cycle paths which are visible from the moon, but which suddenly stop in the middle of nowhere or turn into car parks.
Yeah,
they're doing it to fulfill quotas rather than because they really either understand the problem or believe what they're saying. It's a pity because if more people did it, we'd have a much healthier population and a much happier one. But alas, everything is designed around the car still. So quite reasonably, car drivers get annoyed about having to make way for cyclists and stuff like that. And I blame them. Because the thing is never really very intelligently done.
Well, that's the trouble, and I mean, my argument with those who do these things is as well that what they're actually doing is creating more congestion, not less, by all of the measures that they put into place, and they don't give any incentive really to anybody to not drive. Quite frankly,
no, completely not. I mean, it's very hard the way the world is arranged at the moment, particularly for those people who have to take children to nurseries, go on to a place of work. To travel like any other means than the car. The whole way of life is designed around the car. A lot of people drive cars not because they want to or they like it, but because they have to. And there's absolutely no point making life more difficult for them. It's not going to stop them driving cars. It's just going to make them annoyed.
Yes.
I just think we should redesign our cities and indeed our countryside around a different form of transport. But ever since the Beeching report of the 1960s, it's been car. The Ministry for Transport is the Ministry for Cars.
Yes, well, quite. But that's another story for another day, I suppose, because once again, you may well be accused again of talking common sense and or demanding evidence, which, of course, you were accused of at the weekend.
You mustn't do that. No, it's you're treated with immense suspicion and hostility. There's some academic posted things saying, well, the reason why flu has disappeared is that the flu is so much, infections of flu are so much less virulent than those of a virus. Because I was asking her exactly why it was that the flu had virtually disappeared and COVID hadn't. And the standard response to this is that everybody's been following the social distancing and hygiene measures. Well, if it works against flu, why doesn't it work in exactly the same way against COVID?
Well, exactly right. And this well,
they have different infection rates. So I said, okay, well, thanks very much, but can you point me to where this is explained? And that was the point at which I began to be treated as if I was some kind of vandal who'd put a brick through her window. Very, and I was told I should have Googled it. I said, well, you said it.
Right.
The other one, so I'm constantly accused of claiming to have of having theories about the outbreak. I don't have any theories about it. I'm just because I'm not equipped to do so. I'm just skeptical about a lot of the things which authority and the majority of the media say. And think they should be tested.
Yeah.
And this increasingly, it gets me. I was the noted author of anti-God children's books, Philip Pullman, was having a go at me at the weekend.
I saw that. Yeah.
Insinuating that I had said things which had led to to doctors being insulted. I've never said anything which would suggest that doctors. Insulted, and why would I?
No, but this is a new tactic, Peter, that they've brought in.
It's just a smear, and Sir Philip himself. People should look this up. It has an interesting record on Twitter, which doesn't really put him in a very good position for berating me. But I mean, it is over and over again, this suggestion that things that I've said or done have led to bad behaviour by people which I've not encouraged, or deaths in which I've had no part. And I accept that the other side have good intentions and a reasonable point of view, and I start from the position, okay, then let's discuss this rationally. And this to begin with, this was met by either blank hostility or silence. Now it's being met with a much more worrying thing, which is an attempt to shut me and others up by guilt by association smears. And it's serious. If you have a society without opposition, then you get the Iraq War, and you get thalidomide being given to pregnant women, and you get all kinds of mistakes being made because opposition is vital to the proper consideration of policy decisions. And a fascinating thing, which Jonathan Sumption, Lord Sumption, wrote in the Mail on Sunday, yesterday, which is well worth examining, which is, he pointed out that there was actually quite serious contingency planning for a major pandemic of a respiratory disease. Plans existed, and they didn't remotely resemble what we did, but they were just chucked aside in a moment in that extraordinary week of panic in late March. But we did have a plan, and it was based on decades of experience, the sort of thing which civil servants are expert in drawing up. But it was just chucked away. And we decided to copy China instead. And this is the most extraordinary revelation. And people should realize that there always has been an alternative approach, which is perfectly serious, perfectly humane, just as concerned about saving life as the closure of our society, and that it existed and was discarded.
Yes, I think that he also suggests that the government was spooked by what they saw going on in Italy, not least by the sort of and we've talked about this before, you and I, the sort of the numbers of lorries turning up, the video pictures of inside hospitals where there were bodies just literally piled up everywhere, and I think that really, really spooked them, because it did look an awful situation. But we've never had that situation, and we never did have it, and it wasn't because we locked it down. It was just because it just didn't happen.
No, it's also the regrettable truth that a lot of things go on in our society which don't tend to get filmed most of the time, which, if they were filmed, would make people very distressed. And I think that it's essential to realise that a lot of the difference lies in the coverage and the intensity of interest in it, which makes it seem, I won't say worse than it is, but it certainly makes it seem very worrying. And people are afraid of disease and death, with perfectly good reason. And if they're given a constant diet of disease and death on their television screens and in their newspapers, then they will become worried. It will change their behaviour and their way of thinking. I just think that people should be a bit more cautious about the way in which these things are done, and also a bit more cautious in the way in which they respond to media coverage. That's asking more, though, I have to say. The power of seeing a chaotic hospital with people running and shouting and people dying, or a huge coffin-filled morgue on the screen, the power of that on the mind is vast.
Yes. Well, it's similar to something that happens every time there's an air crash. It doesn't happen so much anymore because there aren't so many air crashes. But I always remember when I was in newspapers, and you still are, obviously, Peter, whenever there was an air crash, you would suddenly have a flurry of reports of near misses. And suddenly that would make it into the papers for about a week. And everyone would say, yeah, but this happens every day. There's a near miss practically every day. It only really gets reported in the wake of an air crash.
Indeed, and it's also the case with train crashes, which are terrible things. Large numbers of people die at once, but in fact, the railways remain extraordinarily safe. But the thing is that train crashes, when they happen, the numbers of dead are large. The aerial pictures of the concertina train are dramatic and frightening. But in fact, if we covered road crashes in the same way, it would rapidly become clear that roads are far more dangerous than trains. But in fact, the coverage continues to suggest that trains are terribly dangerous, and train crashes happen a lot. Which is it's just the way in which the media operates means that these misleading estimates of the importance of events, the context of them, are actually far too common. It's a major fault.
Yes, it is. But I'll tell you what,
we should try harder to correct it.
Yeah, what I find slightly more disturbing is what you mentioned there about Philip Pullman and others who have now started to use as a tactic this kind of blame game where they say that what you say is dangerous and it has this terrible effect. I mean, here's a guy, I know you don't want to say it, but I will say it, who I pointed out, I think, on your Twitter feed, once called for the lynching of the Prime Minister. So his idea of you somehow inciting other people is rather ironic for a start.
I should say here, he says that's not what he was doing, but he did take the tweet down. So
yes.
Oddly enough, I think he's more silly than anything else.
Yes.
I've criticised his books, and I think he doesn't really like that very much.
Well, I mean, he's also written about what a terrible country Britain is, which is a country which has made him rather wealthy, not least by providing him with large funds of money for the BBC.
Well, indeed, but let's not enter into the strange world of
no, let's not.
Or Sir Philip Pullman, as I think we should stress his title.
Yes, indeed. Because I've had the same, funnily enough, because I do occasionally get into rows with cyclists on Twitter, and they accuse me of creating an atmosphere where cyclists can be harmed by motorists because I'm anti-cyclist, which I'm not. But I ask for cyclists to behave as they would if they were driving a car and try to adhere to the rules as best they can and not go through red lights.
I would say there is, this is not you, but I would say there is exaggerated hostility on the part of some motorists towards cyclists. And if ever you get into any sort of altercation, invariably someone will say to you, but you don't pay road tax. To which I respond, well, actually, I pay an enormous amount of tax towards the road, because I pay a lot of income tax, and there is no such thing as road tax as it happens. But that idea has been spread, that cyclists can free ride on expensive roads made for them. On the other hand, I would completely side with those people who say an awful lot of cyclists just break the rules all the time. But it does make, some of these things do make for hostility. I'm not saying anybody's been killed as a result of it, but I think you can create unnecessary hostility but I would challenge anybody to say that anything that I said has ever encouraged anybody to be rude to a hard-working doctor in the middle of a outbreak of disease, because it wouldn't even ever occur to me. What would be the point?
No, of course. I was speaking to a statistician this morning, Jenkins, who used to be at the ONS, and I said to him, it's not as though any of us don't believe this to be a serious pandemic or a serious disease or a serious virus. It's not that. It's just that we want accountability and honesty from the politicians. And whenever I now hear this 100,000 figure dead being trotted out, it's as if nobody now questions it. Nobody says, as I said to him this morning, is it not possible that some of those people who have had a COVID positive test in the last 28 days before they died, is it not possible that they did not die of COVID? And it is, and he conceded that it was possible. And so the 100,000, so I'd much rather have a proper figure of what the so-called excess deaths are, and that would be more honest, I think.
Well, completely. And the 100,000 figure is interesting. But again, I can't say, because I have no means of knowing. I can't say the figure is inaccurate or misleading. I can say, however, that the way in which the figures are gathered and recorded makes it perfectly possible that there is an overestimate here. And I say again and again that right back in April, Dr. Jenny Harris, one of the Deputy Chief Medical Officers, made this very point at a government press conference. Dying with and dying of are not the same thing. And I have to say, we've seen much less of Dr. Harris than of the other Deputy Chief Medical Officer or the other medical officers since she said that, but that probably is completely coincidental.
Well, it may well be. But it is interesting, isn't it, that we're getting a message now that's coming quite loud and clear through certain avenues, shall we say, of the press, that Boris Johnson wants to lift the lockdown more. However, he's being sort of stymied from doing so by the science and by the scientists, almost as if he's being held hostage.
The scientists have one responsibility, and which is to constantly stress the dangers which can be avoided by taking certain precautions. They have no wider responsibilities at all. They don't have to worry about whether the actions which they propose or defend have collateral effects on cancer treatment, heart disease, or anything else. Or that they don't have to worry about the fact they're never even asked to consider the effects of these things upon the old, living on their own, upon divided families, and the other demoralising things, which I believe are actually making quite a lot of people ill. They don't have to, and they're not elected. They don't have to go before the public. They have one responsibility. Because the other thing is, if they get it wrong, and if they offer advice which then leads, which when taken then leads to bad things, then they face blame for it. And one of the problems about making restrictions, and this is my great metaphor. This isn't even really a metaphor. Is Margaret Thatcher's gates in Downing Street, and there they are. They were put up because of some alleged threat that Hezbollah was going to come driving up Downing Street with a lorry load of explosives about 20 years ago, and they will never ever move because no one will ever, no expert, no security chief will ever say these gates should go, because if in any time period from 6 months to 60 years afterwards, Hezbollah eventually do turn up with a lorry load of explosives, then that person will be blamed for having taken the gates away. And that's the problem with restrictions. Once you put them in place, no one will take responsibility for removing them. That requires political courage.
And also, there's no question, I don't think, that some of these people who work in public health, and I use that almost as though it's the same as the distinction between with COVID and of COVID, because working in public health doesn't necessarily make you an expert in health. You don't have to be one. You can be a behavioural scientist. You can be somebody who's written a couple of interesting dissertations about people and how they relate to illness. It doesn't have to be that you're a doctor. And I think these are people who live their lives, or at least maybe they don't live their lives this way, but they make out that we should all live our lives avoiding as much risk as possible. And some people don't want to live like that.
Well, they're utopians. They have, as a good friend of mine keeps pointing out, they've decided that we should live in a new Jerusalem of total safety. And it sounds quite attractive. You think, well, no risk, death pushed to the very margins of society, disease reduced to the minimum. Well, actually, we've done a heck of a lot to do that in the past 20 or 30 years, which is why so many more people are living so much longer. But if you take it beyond a certain point where life has to be so restricted as the price for it, then many people will say, well, actually, do I want to live in this new Jerusalem? I quite like the old Jerusalem, thank you very much, or indeed the old Wolverhampton. I don't want to be there, but there's never been an election in which somebody has stood and said, look, what we've decided to do, and what if we're in government, we will do, is create a society in which you are so safe that actually you can't leave your homes for large periods of the year. You're constantly washing and sanitizing yourself. You can't mix with people. The pubs all have to close. Lots of industries have to close. Foreign travel becomes an impossibly expensive and difficult enterprise. If people were given this option, they might say, well, actually, I might prefer a little bit more risk and a bit less restriction. But no one's ever offered them this choice.
Well, that's the problem. I mean, I lived in New York in the 80s, and it was slightly grubby, quite dangerous, thrilling, and an incredible city. Now it's just another city, because Rudolph Giuliani kind of ruined it by making it completely and utterly for a crime-free. He got rid of the mafia. He got rid of the insider trading on Wall Street. He got rid of the hot dog sellers. And I was in a taxi once, and the guy says, why is he getting rid of that? This is New York. It's not Salt Lake City. But he's kind of turned into Salt Lake City.
I'm not sure. I'm slightly with Giuliani there, having got in the late 70s. Wandered into the wrong part of town after dark, and sincerely wish that I hadn't. I'm quite in favour of making New York a bit more crime-free. And it wasn't always a dump of crime. I think that in the era before really the late 60s and 70s, it was quite a well-policed city, and it suddenly went down this spiral. So I'm not entirely sure I'd go with you there, Mike. I think there are some risks I'm quite keen on suppressing.
I know what you mean, but I just find it. I find it's like Disney. I mean, I used to go to 42nd Street, Times Square, which was an absolute kind of ghastly, debauched place full of crackheads, hookers, porn theatres, and that kind of thing. And now it's like Disneyland, and somehow it doesn't work for me.
No, well, I can see that, but I think other people would say, well, maybe there's a price to be paid for having an orderly city where people are safe from being mugged and burgled, and where drug abuse is discouraged and things like that. So I wouldn't. There is obviously a point, and you and I disagree about it. Exactly where the intervention of the law and the state should begin. But I think that the level of restriction under which we currently live, and may, it seems to me, live for some time to come, goes a lot further than a police crackdown on porn and drugs and muggers. This is the restriction of the law-abiding and the narrowing of life to such an extent that we may be safe, but safe to do what? We're alive but not living.
Yes, I think that's very true. Peter, we're out of time, sadly, but we will be reconvening on Wednesday with you and Dan Hodges, head to head, I think we're going to call it. Hopefully that will go well, and we'll be recording that for a publication and broadcast a little bit later on this week. Peter Hitchens, Mail on Sunday, columnist.